Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm again joined by Right Ruminations. Today's discussion will be about the legacy of Luther, specifically within the context of our broader right-wing discussions of the Parthenon, how the certain narrative about Luther has developed within members of the Parthenon, and how that narrative may or may not be true, and what are Luther's actual legacy. So, Right Ruminations, why don't you sketch for us Luther the man, and then the narrative of the dissident right about Luther?
So Luther the man was initially an Augustinian monk in the Roman Catholic tradition, born in the late 15th century. That's the late 1400s. And in response to a number of what he perceived as abuses on the part of the Roman Catholic Church, involving sale of indulgences, generally extravagant lifestyles, and also I think a kind of overbearing tone that was inherent in scholastic philosophy at the time, Luther launched a polemic in his position as an Augustinian monk and as an academic against what he saw as at that time as a corruption of the papacy. Ultimately, in response to the sale of indulgences, in brief, that's basically the sale of pieces of paper that supposedly would be able to get one out of purgatory and into heaven. Those are still a part of Catholic doctrine, but the sale of them is long discontinued. He published the infamous 95 Theses, which he at least apocryphally nailed to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. In response to this, he was brought under examination by Cardinal Cajetan, who was a very doctrinaire Thomist, to my understanding, who basically just demanded that Luther recant. He didn't give him any kind of hearing. And so that exacerbated the problem. Luther's critique of humanism and of scholasticism intensified. In response to this, he was called to something called the Diet of Worms, which was a convening of the Holy Roman Empire to basically argue his position. It didn't end well, and he had to be basically put under house arrest by his own allies to protect him from the emperor, that's Charles V. And the reason he was ultimately able to survive this incident was because he was under the protection of the Prince of Electoral Saxony, Frederick the Wise, who basically facilitated the German Reformation by protecting Luther from the Holy Roman Empire. Now, to place Luther in the context of other theological controversies that came about, one of his allies, Karlstadt, was somebody who basically went even further than Luther and was causing some rebellious, sort of almost proto-evangelical zeal in Saxony. And in response to this, Frederick the Wise charged Luther with basically polemicizing against the rebellion. So Luther was simultaneously going after the Catholic Church while also going against the sectarian, the Zwickau prophets, as they were called. Luther basically continues in this capacity for about a decade until another diet is called the Diet of Augsburg, which Luther cannot attend because he's excommunicated at this point. But his place is taken by another ally of his, Cajetan. And in light of that, basically a Protestant alliance is made between various Northwestern European powers, and they go to war with the Holy Roman Empire. And within his protected status in Electoral Saxony, Luther eventually dies of natural causes. And by the time the Holy Roman Empire invade the territory, the damage has already been done and the legacy of Luther established. So that's a brief 5-minute sketch of Luther's life with respect to his intellectual influence.
Okay. Now, what would you say is the, could you sketch it's rooted in a Catholic critique, but it's the broader dissident right critique, which has been voiced by people like Murray Rothbard at times, people like Mencius Moldbug, about how modern progressivism is in some sense traceable to the Reformation?
Well, with respect to the idea that, say, cultural Marxism, as we now call it, that's probably the best term for it, has roots in the Reformation, the critique is usually as follows. In the medieval period, you had a kind of authority-centric school of thought known as Platonic realism. And this was based on Plato's idea of the forms, the idea that there are moral absolutes, that William of Ockham, to whom Luther was indebted, came along in, I think, the late 14th century, and said that these moral universals, they don't really exist, that God does impose certain laws, but these laws that God imposes do not necessarily exist simply because of God's existence. That is, he deconstructed a rationalist basis for Christianity. And by the time that Luther comes along, the Ockhamist school of thought is already well established at the University of Wittenberg. So Luther is inheriting this system, and both Luther and Calvin express indebtedness to William of Ockham. And the reason that Luther does this is because Luther says that salvation is not something due to man, right, based on man's natural works, that this is not something that exists purely based on some kind of universal form of justice, but it's because God arbitrarily dictates that this man is saved, therefore this man is saved. So there's an emphasis on kind of the subjective word of God as a preliminary, as something that has to come before any law, any mandate that takes place in the real world. Now, how people like Richard M. Weaver or Russell Kirk or some of the earlier traditionalists associated with the new conservatives could have interpreted this is to say that this led to moral relativism. And I think that the way of looking at it that people like Mencius Moldbug and Murray Rothbard has, I think comes from this Weaverian idea that it was the deconstruction of Platonic realism which led to the Reformation, which led to relativism. And so that modernity sort of started with William of Ockham, but was exacerbated by Luther. And there are some problems with this, which I'm sure we'll be getting into. But one of those problems is, of course, that neither Ockham nor Luther took nominalism to indicate, say, that homosexuality was admissible or that atheism was admissible. They weren't actually questioning what those moral laws were. They were simply questioning whether or not they had to exist as some kind of a priori idea in the mind of God, which I think is a question that's kind of extrinsic to Christian theology.
Yeah. Now, one element as well to sort of frame this is within the broader Reformation zeitgeist in Europe. So beginning roughly in the early 14th century with the Babylonian captivity, there was a crisis of faith in the Catholic Church and a crisis of identity within the Catholic Church, because you essentially had the Avignon papacy, and then you had then, after 60, 70 years of the captivity, another pope who said, oh, okay, well, I'm the real pope. And he had two popes. Then there was the Council of Constance, which was supposed to resolve it. But then the pope who was elected for the Council of Constance, the other two popes said, we don't recognize him. And it led to this, we had Catholics fighting Catholics in the name of opposite popes. And it wasn't, unlike anti-popes of the past, it wasn't clear who was the anti-pope. because the Pope in Avignon had been considered legitimate for decades, only, you know, and nobody had really done a whole lot to challenge that. Beginning of that time, actually, you could even argue beginning earlier with the increasing wealth and power of the popes of Cluny, which ushered in the Crusades. You had the Waldensians and Arnold of Brescia from Italy, who advocated for apostolic poverty. You had around the time of Constance, the Hussite rebellion, and you had the primary topic of the Hussite rebellion was the elements of the bread and wine. Who could take it? The Catholic Church said only the clergy could have wine, and both the radical wing, the Taborites, and the moderate wing, the Utraquists, said no. Well, both clergy and lay people can take the wine. And then you also had Wycliffe in England. These are all proto-Protestant groups, and they begin to arise as the papacy is consolidating power under the bishops of Cluny. And then, of course, the crisis of conscience and crisis of identity, which occurs with the Babylonian captivity. And within that milieu, there's this general angst against the Catholic Church, which is represented in the Northern Renaissance, aka the Reformation. It's often called the Northern Renaissance because two of its leading thinkers were Catholic. Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, and the author of My Namesake, Praise of Folly, Isidore Erasmus. But it's more also famously associated with Luther, Calvin, and the other Protestants. In the Southern Renaissance, it tended to be humanistic and pagan, like Boccaccio, Machiavelli, groups like that. So they're two expressions of dissent against the Catholic Church. Now, Luther, of course, is one voice. Now, what then ends up happening is there's already an independent English tradition going back to Wycliffe, independent of Luther entirely, which eventually does give rise to Henry VIII. And then you have in Geneva, Zwingli and Calvin, which take a harder line even than Luther. And then you've got various Anabaptist groups. And so there's this discontent. See, not to go all Marxist on everybody. I do believe in the great man of history to an extent, but I think something like the Reformation was going to happen with or without Luther. There was so much discontent already boiling up at that time. You had the perfect storm of technological innovation with the printing press. One could argue the Protestants were the first shitlords using the printing press to attack the Catholic Church in the way that the modern day right uses the internet to attack progressive elites. I think something like that would have happened. Now, of course, Luther, because of his charisma, his persona, sort of charted a course that the Reformation would take, at least in certain areas. But this is where I think the narrative begins to break down. The Catholic and reactionary critique of the Reformation is that it's individualistic and divided in its origins and its leadership and its focus. But then they attribute a kind of monolithic influence and control to Luther in his negative consequences that completely undercuts the earlier claim that the Reformation is this divided anarchic movement. To me, it's not a consistent critique. It's either one or the other. So I would say that would be one of my first objections. I just don't see that as a consistent critique. But also within the Reformation, there were really two broad schools. There's what you might say the conservative school, which represented the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church. They believed that, broadly speaking, practices that were carried over from the Catholic Church that they believed did not directly contradict Scripture were permissible, adiaphora in the Greek, indifferent. Whereas the radical school, beginning in Geneva with Zwingli and Calvin, and then later the Anabaptists, anything that could not be justified from Scripture should be removed. And I think everybody from the time period itself, and then looking back from the present, would say that the Anabaptists were the most radical and cutting away the fat, so to speak. And the difference within the radicals was a difference of emphasis. The Anabaptists emphasized the New Testament and the teachings of Christ, whereas the Reformed, the Calvinists emphasized a more Old Testament continuity They emphasized the continuity of the Old and New Testaments rather than the Anabaptists, who emphasized the sort of discontinuity. Now, neither group was so glib as to say there were no differences or there was a total separation. It was more of a matter of emphasis, which worked itself out in their application of radical principles. And as we see with these groups, even within the generation of the Reformation, they led to radically different social systems, radically different outgrowths than each other. So I think that would be my first criticism, is that if the Reformation is anarchic and decentralized as the reactionary arguments are, it's difficult to understand how you could ascribe Luther so much influence.
Well, there are a number of problems with that argument. One of them, of course, is the fact that such breakdowns of the existing Catholic monarchical order took place in Catholic nations, regardless of whether or not those places had Protestant Reformation. So, for example, and you find this in Eastern Orthodoxy as well, and we've talked about this before, so I won't go too deeply into it. But of course, in France, you have the French Revolution. In Russia, you have the Russian Revolution. And in many South American sort of reactionary Catholic countries, you have revolutions which are much more explicitly anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, anti-traditional than anything that comes out of the Protestant Reformation, or at least comparable. And a second problem is that cultural Marxism, the type of modernity that a lot of us complain about today, is not really decentralist in character. It's not relativistic in character. It's not really something that you would attribute to a breakdown of any morally universal system. That is to say, the cultural Marxists are a universalist, moralistic, and really explicitly anti-relativistic ideology. And so it doesn't make sense to attribute it to a kind of radicalization of any development of nominalism, because insofar as you would attribute the universalist origins of cultural Marxism to, say, Protestantism, then you might as well also attribute them to Catholicism, especially when you have antecedents like the French Revolution, which was highly centralist, the Russian Revolution, which was highly centralist. Now, there is one area where I think political correctness or cultural Marxism does have Luther and Protestantism as an antecedent, and that is in its iconoclastic elements. That is, within Protestantism, you find a lot of removal of ecclesiastical artwork, of, say, radically changing the music, of having generally a kind of attitude that I suppose is willing to make gestures towards ugliness or de-beautification as a kind of sign of virtue. And you certainly see that kind of iconoclastic attitude toward established cultures in political correctness. But my ultimate my at least tentative verdict is that I think cultural Marxism is a kind of synthesis of Protestant iconoclasm and Catholic universalism, but it's in no way clear that that cultural Marxism is characterized by Protestantism as such.
Yeah, I would push back on that last point a bit here, in the sense that if we look at a snapshot, say 1517 to 1617, there's a revolutionary order, in other words, a Protestant revolutionary order, overthrowing a Catholic order. And like any revolution, it's going to be violent. But if we take a snapshot from, say, 313 to 413, we would see a very similar level of iconoclasm against pagan images, statues, and temples. And so, and we go even further back to the book of Joshua and Judges, where the Hebrew people destroyed the image, well, I rather failed to destroy the images of the Canaanites. So if anything, the iconoclastic tendency, I think, is a tendency that's rooted in some sort of Abrahamic faith. Muslims express it, Jews express it. Under certain conditions, Catholics express it. So Protestantism might have been the last of the 16th century, might have been the last visible expression of that iconoclasm within a religious context. But I think more broadly speaking, it's an element of Abrahamic religions. But not even that. It's just an element of revolution. Because even the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, when it would conquer a new society, it would destroy what was there before. In fact, the early church fathers would mock the Roman state as saying, you worship the gods of people you conquered and whose temples you destroyed. Do you think those gods are going to reciprocate the favor to you? So I'm not even sure even you can limit it to Abrahamic religions.
Well, to an extent I agree with you, to an extent I disagree with you. Here's where I agree with you. That obviously these tendencies exist within human nature, or else Protestantism would have had nothing to latch on to, right? So it's not exclusive to Protestantism. I also agree with you that this is something that is probably more concentrated in Abrahamic religions than it is in religions that are not such. And in this sense, I actually believe that the alt-right has a point, right? That it, sociologically speaking, I'm not attacking Christianity theologically, but sociologically speaking, I think that there is a tendency, a kind of ironic tendency within expressions of Christianity to be destructive, you might say aesthetically destructive, in a way that's equated with a certain degree of moral rectitude. And that's something that I think that we can fairly say of Christianity, because obviously being one religion among many, there are going to be certain things, even if you believe in Christianity, that are going to be deficient in some areas for whatever reason, misinterpretation, sociological factors, historical factors, what have you. Now, where I would disagree with you is with respect to the character that this takes on in Protestantism. I think because it was trying to address a problem in identity within Christianity, that elements of Protestant iconoclasm became integrated into the theology of Protestantism in a way that I think in previous revolutionary overturns within the Abrahamic tradition, it may have progressed on from that. This is not the case with all Protestants, but there is a decidedly you might say opposition to the stunning within certain manifestations of non-magisterial Protestantism, for better or for worse, which continues to the present day, right? You see it in things like the mega churches. You see it in you see it in various, like for example, the fundamentalist movement in the early 20th century. You can just see it in everyday conversation with sectarian Protestants. I'm sure if we were to have a conversation, there would be positions that you would advocate that I would interpret that way. And so I think that what I would say is that there are different elements in Catholicism that influence cultural Marxism, and there are different ones that are in Protestantism that influence it. What I would say is that the enthusiasm with, say, Archbishop Cranmer dismantled church organs, or the enthusiasm with which the Zwickau prophets dismantled various forms of artwork, has a kind of populist element, you might say, a kind of identification with a universalist zeal that has become part of the psychology of the West. Now, on the other hand, of course, though, this idea of imperial universalism is something that comes to cultural Marxism more from Catholicism via the intermediary of the French and Russian revolutions, which then took on the institutional structures of high church theocracy. So that would be my account of this.
Yeah, I think, not to belabor the point too much longer, I would say that the acts of vandalism in the 4th and 5th century against pagan temples and images was very much analogous to 16th century examples. But I think what you're getting at is that while previous revolutions would have destroyed images of the old, they would have created images of their own. Whereas many Protestant sects are just happy to leave the image space vacant. I think that's where you would say the difference is.
Sure, and that really, I think, is something that has very much made its way into the psychology of the modern West. That is, I think that there is, and I think even a Protestant who was against images would see this as a misinternalization of their disposition, which is that there is this tendency that I think is very specific to the modern West of equating ugliness with virtue as a kind of display of virtue. Now, of course, the Protestants had antecedents for this in Catholicism, right? You do see certain aspects of this in monasticism, but I think that it was manifested in such a way in the Reformation that it took on this kind of this aspect of a display of virtue, and you really see that today with things like the tearing down of statues, which once again always existed, but this kind of association with anti-aesthetic tendencies and virtue, and some perception of a connection between the two.
Yeah. Now, I think the core of this argument on the dissident right against Luther is nominalism. This sort of philosophical. There's a couple of things you can say about this. On the one hand, there are versions of it that seem to smack pretty strongly of the genetic fallacy. You can argue the genetic origins of these ideologies to say someone like Luther or Occam, and that's it. But the other element that's probably a little more serious is there's a kind of just so-ness about it that leaves me skeptical. So let me give you an example. There's a statement in Tertullian's De Anima against on the soul, against the Pythagorean doctrine of reincarnation, and in a sort of very strong satirical language, because he's trying to argue that if reincarnation were correct, we would not expect to see population growth because new people are just dead people reincarnated. So where are we getting new people from? And he's like, oh, that's what we have, plagues and wars and famines and floods to kill people so we don't have this imbalance of reincarnated peoples. I kid you not, so many times throughout my life, I've read people cite that as Tertullian being concerned about overpopulation and as a proto-environmentalist. Now, that is a patently absurd reading of the passage. Tertullian was a well-known satirist and I wouldn't say jokester, but he would have been a shitlord, let's be honest. Tertullian would have been a shitlord if he'd been alive today. And in a lot of regards, he said things that were over the top, but he didn't necessarily mean them. And I think in a lot of ways, Luther does that too. Like when he said reason is Satan's whore. He's because Tertullian, is famous for Athens versus Jerusalem. He says, what do they have in common? Which leads some people to interpret him as an obscurantist anti-rationalist. But then if you read his, on the soul, he takes a Stoic view of the soul, that it's corporeal. So he's clearly familiar with Stoic writings, and he's influenced by Stoic philosophy. So is he really an obscurantist anti-reason person? That was a just so story that I grew up with. And as I read the church fathers, I'm like, this doesn't really pan out. Like Tertullian's own writings don't bear this out. Now, I can't pretend to have read Luther's writings, but I get a very distinct feel that kind of misunderstanding or disconnect with what Luther is saying, and then these conclusions that are being drawn from them. He's a bit of a prankster. He printed pamphlets of, literally a human butt with a harp in it, to make fun of the Catholic Church. In a lot of ways, he's not being serious. And so, I've even talked to Lutherans who say half the time what Luther said, he was drunk when he said it. So we can't take it too seriously anyhow. I I think that's an undue reading into what he's saying, because he is kind of a troll, to use a modern parlance. And even by admission of people who follow Luther, he was drunk a lot of the time, so what he said was just nonsense within those contexts. So I would say that it sort of smacks to me of the genetic fallacy. It sort of smacks to me of a just so story based on taking a few key statements of Luther out of any context, in a way analogous to Tertullian the obscurantist or Tertullian the environmentalist.
Well, I think there's no doubt that both Tertullian and Martin Luther had attitude problems, but I think that they may have had very different types of attitude problems that may have been a little bit different than you might think. That I think that certain similarities might have actually been not quite as pronounced as one might think. Now, in Tertullian's case, you're absolutely right. That in one passage he'll write that I believe because it's ridiculous, but then in another passage he'll write that Christianity is the fulfillment of Greek philosophy. So there's kind of this question of, well, what does he really think? And I get the sense that he's the type of person who changed his mind a lot, but when he said something, really believed it at the moment. Whereas I think that with Luther, his humor has a darker quality to it. And I think that it's more I think it's more pointed, and I think that Luther was more linear in his thought. He may have changed, but it has a change that takes on more of the character of an evolution, as it were. So whereas you have Tertullian, maybe he just liked to play devil's advocate a lot, was kind of snarky. I think like a kind of it was a little bit more obsessive. That is because you see this consistency, right? And I think the humor is almost a kind of elucidation on that. So what I'm really getting at is I think that Luther's opposition to scholasticism was more pointed and more consistent than Tertullian's rejection of Neoplatonism. But that's just my interpretation. Go ahead.
I've never read much Luther. I'm not a Luther expert, so I'm not speaking from a point of knowledge about Luther. But let me give you an example. The famous diet of worms statement. Luther says, unless I am convinced by scripture and plain reason, my conscience is captive to the word of God. So there he refers to reason in a favorable context. And then you might find another context where he calls reason the devil's whore. With regards to Thomism, it's sort of a polemical attack on Thomist philosophy. Well, I mean, just put those two quotes next to each other and it sounds really weird. But I think what's happening is, let me put it this way, I'm sure there's a broader context to Luther's life that I'm not aware of, but the treatment of Luther by these far-right types, I think, is also unaware of that broader context. And doesn't give me any reason to think that they are, and to figure out, well, how are these things reconciled or not reconciled?
Right. Well, with respect to that passage, what I would say is that Luther's appearance of inconsistency here is it seems to me, based on what I know of him, as more emblematic of a certain rhetoric, right? I think he's using rhetoric, but ultimately there's the same point that he's making behind it. When he says reason there, what he means is an interpretation of scripture based on one's immediate perception of it, say, as opposed to a conciliar pronouncement made on it. But to address what you were saying about the dissident right or the reactionaries, one thing that we had talked about briefly before having this discussion was that the alt-right's critique of Christianity is actually at cross purposes with the reactionaries' critique of Christianity or the traditionalists' critique of Protestantism. And the reason is this, is that the traditional, say, Catholic argument polemic against Luther is that it was the nominalistic spirit that ultimately led to relativism. But in contrast to this, the alt-right's critique of Christianity is that it is a continuation of Socratic universalism. Now, those two arguments, to my thinking, are not compatible, because you can't simultaneously blame cultural Marxism or late modernity on both relativism and universalism. That would be contradictory. So the alt-right critique of Christianity, in a roundabout way, could be interpreted as more sympathetic to Luther. I know they wouldn't like to hear that, but it's true. It is more sympathetic to Luther, because Luther was at cross purposes with Platonic realist universalism. And so really the traditionalist conservative polemic against nominalism as the root of late modernity is really at cross purposes with the alt-right critique of Christianity as the antecedent of late modernity due to its universalism. So I think that in a sense, you might be able to merge to some extent the alt-right's critique of Christianity with a pro-Lutheran position.
You could. The other thing too, I'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, one of the two legitimate philosophy sources I was allowed to use in college from an online source, the other being the Stanford. The sort of Occamite background is described thus. William of Ockham recognized the shortcomings of Thomas's system and cut away most of the ontological grounding of existence. In its place, Ockham posited revelation and covenant. The world does not need to be grounded in some artificial, unknowable ladder of being. Instead, one must rely on God's faithfulness. We are contingent upon God alone. This contingency would be terrible and unbearable without the assurances of God's covenant. In the terms of God's absolute power, God can do anything. He can make a lie the truth. He can make adultery a virtue and a monogamy a vice. The only limit to this is his power. The only limit to this power is consistency. God cannot contradict his own essence. To live in a world ordered by whim would be terrible. One would never know if one is acting justly or unjustly. However, God has decided on a particular way of acting. God has covenanted with creation and committed himself to a particular way of acting. And then he says here, however, from Thomas's perspective, the divine spark is infused with God's grace, giving one the power to be contrite and cooperating with God. This cooperation with God's grace merits God's reward. However, Occam asks an important question. If the process begins with God's infusion of grace, can it truly merit anything? He answered, no. Therefore, you should do the best you can. By doing your best, even minimal as it is, this will be merit, an infusion of grace. Doing one's best means rejecting evil and doing good. So I have read Reformed scholars who will say that God could command the opposite. Like Gordon Clark, a 20th century English Calvinist writer, has at times written that, yeah, God could change his mind on these things, but he won't. Now, I don't know how much that is representative of established Protestant thought, though anecdotally, Gordon Clark is one guy that I could point to do that. But if we believe, if the Occamite project was that, you know, we don't ground existence in the great chain of being, but directly being infused by God, that sounds an awful lot like Bishop Berkeley from Ireland in the 18th century. And that's not at all obvious how that leads to cultural Marxism. I mean, there may be criticisms to be leveled against that line of thinking, but I don't see how that leads to cultural Marxism.
Well, this brings to mind a rather amusing anecdote by the theologian and also not Austrian economist, but pro-Austrian economics professor Ronald Nash, who had a rather entertaining discussion with the presuppositionalist Cornelius Van Til when they were sitting there having lunch, and Van Til was a radical nominalist going well beyond Luther, who actually did believe that God could, that contradictions logical contradictions could be performed by God. And Nash sat down with him, and Nash was a kind of, I guess, Platonic realist, but they were both Protestant theologians. And Nash said to him, Van Til, do you know that 2 + 2 = 2? And he said that Van Til smiled at me, and he said, yes, I know that 2 + 2 = 2. And then I said, but do you know that, but does God know that 2 + 2 = 2 + 2 = 4? And Van Til said, I don't know. But that aside, yes, I think that it is a rather silly connection, or perhaps not silly, but it rests on a misunderstanding of what late modernity is like and what cultural Marxism is like. Paul Gottfried has often said, there's nothing really relativistic about late modernity or cultural Marxism. These people have a universal ethic, a view of an objective morality that transcends man's decisions, which is every bit as absolute and a priori as as what is taught in Platonic realism. In fact, in a sense, even more so, because the cultural Marxists are not really even willing to entertain, say, hypothetical disagreement as per the scholastic method, the way the Platonic realists were. So it is a misreading, I think, of cultural Marxism as being confused with postmodernism at the hands of people like Jordan Peterson or Richard M. Weaver or Russell Kirk, who are kind of stuck in this sort of 1980s idea of, well, you just have these wild hippie relativists and they're just allowed to run around believing whatever they want. Well, no, they're not. They're moral absolutists who are much closer to Platonic realism than they are to a nominalist frame of mind. And so, if anything, it may very well be a certain nominalistic strand or willingness to entertain divergent possibilities that has actually forestalled the absolute hegemony of cultural Marxism, owing what it does itself to Platonic universalism.
It's an interesting thought. One other, I think, incongruity with the theory is if all of these bad liberal, Marxist, postmodernist, fill in the blank values are a derivative of Luther, of all the European nations, of course, Lutheranism, it did sink roots into Scandinavia, but Germany, Prussia was the flagship Lutheran state, and then later Germany. And yet the alt-right, all across the spectrum, whether you're reactionaries who embody, Frederick the Great, or some sort of Wilhelmine Germany, or not National Socialism, it's Germany that these people point to. I mean, even the arch tradcat E. Michael Jones, in his book The Barren Meadow, points to Germany as the solution to what he considers the evils of capitalism. But Germany was what was the nation most influenced by Luther. So how can Luther be the cause of all of these woes, and then the people of the nation of Germany, who were most influenced by Luther of the nations of Europe, come up with solutions? It's madness.
Well, it is, and I think that, in a sense, both the people who would attribute the tendencies among cultural Marxists to, say, the nominalism of Luther, or on the other hand, to the extravagance of the Catholic Church, are actually both mistaken in that it was the more conservative elements in both Catholicism and Protestantism and in the Reformation that were antecedent to cultural Marxism. That is, it's both the imperial universalism of Catholicism, together with the iconoclasm, as I mentioned before, of Protestantism, which is reinforcing the psychology of late modernity. Whereas, by contrast, the nominalistic anti-absolutist aspect of Luther, together with the you might say the pro-aesthetic kind of architectural or civilizational quality of the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, those together, the more liberal elements of Christianity, are in a certain sense actually a reinforcement against late modernity. So in a strange kind of way, it's actually the cultural Marxists who are kind of the almost a transmogrification of arch-traditionalist Christianity, derived from both Catholicism and Protestantism, whereas, you know, late modernity, bourgeois, kind of modern right-wing thought is more derived from the liberal elements of Catholicism and Protestantism. So in a roundabout way, the late modern cultural Marxists are actually more conservative than the right in a roundabout sort of way.
Well, yeah, I mean, even in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, across the spectrum, commentators on the Soviet Union were always making references to the Pope and the Catholic Church and arguing that Stalin, leading the International, fulfilled the role of the Pope, and all good communists have to fall in line with what the International says. So that kind of superficial observation was common at the time. And so nobody looking at the Soviet Union would have said, yeah, that's from Luther. No, all the rhetoric from critics of the USSR was that it represented the worst elements of the Catholic Church. And, you know, I mean, obviously a Catholic writer like, say, Hilaire Belloc or Chesterton wouldn't have said that, but everybody else pretty much did. So there's that. And it's this critique of Luther also exaggerates how radical he was. Luther, for all of his rhetoric at Worms, was fairly conservative and fairly limited in the actual changes he made, especially in light of the German peasant revolt in northwest Germany and the Anabaptists in Switzerland.
Well, I think that is a good transition into another point, which is what exactly was Luther's social political attitude in comparison to the people that we are discussing. And I think it's important to place Luther in the context of the rise of the modern nation state over and against the Holy Roman Empire, to place him in the context of, you might say, the primacy of something which is not yet the demos, but is not the old monarchical system, but which is the rise of the gentry and the prevalence of the aristocracy, which would later come to more strongly characterize the places in which Lutheranism and Protestantism more generally would take root. This is important because what Luther's political legacy seems to me to have been was rather in keeping with his, and for that matter, Calvin's own view of themselves politically, which was as elitists operating in sovereign, non-imperial states. That is, as you might say, parts of the elite that had departed from the extra-national elite associated with the Habsburgs, in such a way that would make them remarkably reliable antecedents to what we would associate with bourgeois, elitist, nation-state kind of Gottfriedian, paleo-conservative elitism. institutionalist nation-state conservatism. That is, Luther, I think, was both it can be differentiated from both the imperial aspects of Catholicism on the one hand and the iconoclastic exuberance of the Zwickau prophets on the other hand, in such a way as, despite what his political views on this or that given issue is, as decidedly not guilty of either the most severe forms of imperialism associated with Catholicism or the most severe aspects of iconoclasm associated with Protestantism, and therefore not really as a reliable antecedent to the modern left.
Yeah. One other element that really ultimately renders this critique of the globalist left as facile is the fact that many European royal houses were very supportive of the European Union and globalism. So, for example, Otto von Habsburg back it up. There's the infamous Kalergi, who came up with a Kalergi plan to mongrelize Europe by importing all of these non-Europeans into Europe. The alt-right talks about Kalergi quite a bit. And he led the Pan-European Union. Well, he was succeeded by Otto von Habsburg. Otto von Habsburg is considered a hero of the UN, advocated for European cooperation and globalism. And of course, he's a Habsburg, he's a Catholic. That kind of, you could argue that sort of strengthens your point that the sort of universalist imperialism of the Catholic Church was appropriated by the modern left for its purposes. But the Habsburg connection to the European Union, and then by extension globalism, completely annihilates this premise that reactionary high church Catholicism or orthodoxy or whatever is a bulwark against globalist modernity. They help bring it into power.
Well, I agree to the extent to which you are they would attribute the breakdown to magisterial national Catholicism. I think where you and I part ways is that I think that the sectarian deviations from Lutheranism are fair game in this regard, because they, I think, possess elements which were then fused with the Catholic legacy. So in other words, if we're talking about Luther, I'd say that basically the hands of Luther and Calvin can be washed of this problem. If what you're talking about is national Protestantism, if what you're talking about is, for lack of a better term, evangelical Protestantism, I think that has a decidedly more influential character on political correctness, albeit one that can't be understood apart from also competing Catholic and Orthodox influences, which are also present.
I think what we would, despite the emphasis and the nuance we might place on various points, we would both agree that since modern day globalist progressive late modernity has developed out of the Christian West, whether it be Russia or France or England, to that extent, it has antecedents in those three religions, in the amalgamation that it has now become. So you might, I think you'd agree, we could agree on that. Not necessarily what those antecedents might be or how we weight them. We might debate that. But I think we can agree on that statement.
Yeah, I think that my real point in kind of emphasizing both sides is that, ironically, Luther and the national magisterial Protestants, out of all the groups we've discussed, are the least likely culprits. In a weird way, there's a kind of horseshoe theory of Christianity. The more Protestant and the more Catholic you get, the more likely that you've been a contributor to cultural Marxism. Whereas I think that the kind of antecedents to classical liberal, the kind of moderate right nation state of the Western civilization tradition is really has the least to blame on Luther. And in fact, when comparing the High Church with the sectarians, with the national Protestants, out of all three of those groups, it's ironic that the most blame is often laid at the feet of the national Protestants, when in fact they are the ones with whom the lineage is least connected.
Exactly. Even the alt-right, well, he wasn't alt-right at the time. The alt-right likes him. Madison Grant, he was a leading progressive thinker in the early 20th century. In his, I think it was Passing of the Great Race, he points out that internationalism is largely foreign to Protestantism. They were the ones that had race consciousness. So you had all the race anti-miscegenation laws in the American South and South Africa, whereas it was Catholic Latin America where these racial lines, these universal lines were more blurred. And it's odd that this guy who the alt-right wants to own now is one of theirs would correctly point out those general trajectories which the alt-right now, the dissident right generally doesn't see or understand.
Yes, I think that I can't really find anything there to disagree with. I would like to add before wrapping up that insofar as there are things in Luther which might bear some blame for the development of late modernity, such as some of the things I brought up earlier, the irony is that it's never even those things about Luther that the reactionaries will point out. What they'll point out is the fact that he's separated from the Holy Roman Empire, which really has nothing to do with it. And the extent to which Luther was, say, an antecedent to something like, that his actions might ultimately have influenced something like the abolitionist movement or the, prohibitionist movement, just by virtue of having started the process. The extent to which Luther might bear an indirect responsibility for that is never really the thing for which he's criticized. So the irony is that even to the extent that he might bear some of the blame, that's never the manner in which he's blamed.
Exactly. It's misattribution. So would that be your final statement before we wrap this up?
Well, my final statement, just in summary, is that I do regret to an extent not having discussed more about Luther's theology, but I consciously did that because I think we wanted to discuss the political implications of it, to the misfortune of those who may not be familiar with the intricacies of his theology. But that is what it is. I think that the main takeaways from this are that the nominalism and any subsequent relativism that could be attributable to the Protestant Reformation really has nothing to do with cultural Marxism, because the nominalists were not relativists, and even if they were relativists, it would have nothing to do with it, because cultural Marxism is inherently anti-relativistic. And that insofar as there are problems inherent to Christianity that would seem to foreshadow late modernity, these involve basically a kind of universalist, imperialist perspective, for which the Catholic Church is every bit as much to blame as the Protestants. Ultimately, the greatest antecedents in Christianity to late modernity are found within sectarian Protestantism and in ultramontanism, and, as I said earlier, Luther and Calvin, being the proto-nation state elitists that they were, really bear the least to blame for any of the unfortunate realities that we are currently experiencing.
All right. It's always a pleasure. Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing out.